Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Andrew Kruger, and I'm part of the Foster Schools Alumni Engagement Team. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn. It's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor of Management and Michael G. Foster Endowed Fellow, Crystal Farh. Crystal joined the Foster School in 2015 after earning a BA in psychology at Harvard University and a PhD in organizational behavior at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business. Her research explores employee voice, how individuals speak up to fuel creativity and innovation, hence the topic today, teams and leadership. And she has published extensively in her young career. She's won numerous awards for her research, including the Wallace Dissertation Research Award from the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology in 2014, and the Best International Paper Award from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management in 2010. In addition, Crystal has been active and sought after as a reviewer for multiple scholarly journals. In those roles, she has received the Editorial Board Outstanding Reviewer Award from the Academy of Management Journal and the Outstanding Reviewer Award from the OB Division of the Academy of Management. But in addition to being an incredible scholar, she is also known as a star in the classroom. Her students refer to her as motivating, engaging, nurturing. They call her an incredible communicator, someone who is enthusiastic, passionate, and motivating. And one of my favorite comments that somebody made about Crystal is simply that Crystal rocks. No wonder then that, like the other participants this fall, Crystal is a recipient of the PACCAR Award for Teaching Excellence, Foster's highest teaching honor. Crystal, thank you for being here to discuss fostering an idea culture. Take it away.
Wow, Andrew, that was an incredible introduction. Thank you so much for that. And can I just say, I did not expect to see so many faces that I recognize. And so, if you see me waving with the silly smile on my face, it's because I'm so excited to see so many of you, familiar faces, and also those who I've not met before. So, thank you for tuning in. And it's my pleasure to talk about this topic of fostering an idea culture. And I just wanted to quickly start with how I got interested in this topic. So some of you know from my background that I grew up in the United States, so specifically Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Hong Kong, China, which is, I mean, opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of, variety of stimuli. And one thing that I learned very early on is that cultures have a very different idea of what an idea culture looks like and whether it's okay to speak up and what kinds of ideas are valued. And so from a very early age, I started wondering about this question of, what does it mean to have an idea culture? What does it mean where people can speak up, where people have good ideas, where people in power are actually acting on ideas? I wanted to know how this could play out to help individuals be engaged in organizations and also help the organizations themselves to be innovative and better tomorrow than they were today. So I wanted to share a little bit of my insights. The work that I'm talking about is a broad literature base, some of which that I have been able to contribute to. And so some of what I'm talking about is based on the work that others have done, but I've also tried to highlight some of the work that I have done because I have cool graphs and things like that. And so I can talk a little bit more about, how I did the research and things like that. All right. Okay, so I'm excited to get started. Let me pull up my presentation here. If that all looks good to you, can I get a thumbs up? Fantastic. Thanks for the feedback. Okay. All right. So we are living in a COVID-19 era, which means that the status quo is being disrupted at warp speed, right? There are mandates to work from home, which require us to come up with creative ways to collaborate and connect with our coworkers. School closures, daycare closures means that we have to be creative about the way we teach our kids while also being able to stay productive. And there are bans on large gatherings, meaning we have to learn to educate and invigorate each other through online platforms and videos, online platforms such as this one. Now, rightfully so many of us are mourning the loss of the status quo, and we're desperately yearning for that day when normalcy will return. But others of us are realizing that with every disruption comes the possibility of doing things differently and doing them better than before. And so in that context, this idea of fostering an ideal culture is incredibly timely. And let me click my slide. All right. So, what do I mean by fostering an idea culture? I mean, what makes for an idea culture? Well, there are really three ingredients. You need good people, you need people to speak up, and you need receptive leaders. All right. Now, sometimes good ideas come from the top. The all wise, knowing a senior leader who seems to have brilliance at every turn. But more often, ideas are coming from your everyday employees. These are the people who are encountering problems on the job, and they have to come up with solutions to solving those problems in order to get the work done. And so, what that means is that an idea culture needs to be one where everyone, not just the leaders, are coming up with good ideas on how to do things better. Everyone, not just the leaders, are willing to speak up with those ideas, and everyone, especially the leaders, are receptive to acting on those ideas. And it all sounds really straightforward, but actually, each of these components come with its own challenges. So let's start with good ideas. You need good ideas for an idea culture to add value. Now, research suggests that the best ideas, the ones that have the potential to propel your performance forward, well, they're multidimensional, right? They have to have three things. They have to be desirable. And what I mean by desirable is that the idea has to be poised to impact performance in your organization in a positive rather than negative way. Now, that's obvious, but a lot of times ideas that we generate, we don't think through exactly all the implications that it has on performance, right? Sometimes there will be wins, but sometimes there will also be harm that is done. Okay, so overall, you want to have ideas that are going to be desirable, right? If the idea is not desirable, it is at best peripheral in nature, at worst problematic for your performance. Okay. The idea also has to be novel. It has to somehow be sufficiently different from what already exists. It has to somehow change the status quo. And why does this matter? Well, incremental changes, they might boost your performance, but the magnitude of their impact won't be as pronounced. Okay. So when you have ideas that are really novel, that's where you have those breakthroughs. That's where you get that disruption in terms of innovation. And third, the idea has to be feasible, right? Any positive potential gain that comes from having a desirable or novel idea is nullified unless you can realize the idea, meaning you are able to carry out the idea given the resources and technology and constraints that are available to you. All right. So the challenge here is that you need to put the right people in the right conditions to generate good ideas, right? And you need these individuals to speak up. That relates to our second point here. People have to speak up. Now, an idea culture cannot form if people prefer to stay silent instead of raising and proposing their ideas to supervisors and colleagues who can act on those ideas. But research suggests that people actually are quite hesitant to raise their ideas, right? And the reason is because they believe if they speak up and challenge the status quo, they will somehow be seen as disloyal, right? Or that they're criticizing the people who put the status quo there. They're also fearful of looking incompetent. Well, what if their solution doesn't work out, right? They're also concerned about disrupting harmony in the group and potentially jeopardizing relationships. And my research also shows that not all ideas are created equal in terms of this risk, right? There are ideas where there's a clear solution, and those are relatively easy to raise, right? But then there are also ideas that implicitly or explicitly implicate the failure of the current system or problems in the current way things are being done. And those are especially risky to raise because you can be seen as complaining or criticizing and invoking defensiveness. So, the key challenge here is to create a context where people feel safe to share their ideas openly. If you don't have this safe environment where people can speak up, people will otherwise go along with the status quo and remain silent about problems or only propose ideas that are minimally different from the way things currently are. And that limits your ability to really make positive change. Okay, 3. You need receptive leaders, leaders who are open and receptive to making changes. Now, you would think that if people spoke up with good ideas, managers would act on them, right? But research suggests that managers actually prefer suggestions that don't change the status quo very much, right? They don't like to have that status quo disrupted because it might make them look bad as a manager, right? And this is especially likely if managers are feeling insecure about their managerial capabilities, right? They're concerned that if they endorse these change-oriented ideas, it makes them look bad or incompetent. There are also a host of legitimate reasons why managers don't act on ideas. Sometimes they don't have the purview, they don't have the agency to make changes, right? Sometimes there are just multiple ideas on the table, but only one idea can be pursued. And sometimes, quite frankly, the ideas just aren't there yet. Now, the problem is when you don't act on people's ideas, it can breed perceptions of futility, beliefs that management isn't open to change. So what's the point, right? And people stop speaking up. They start withholding their ideas. They essentially are silent. My own research suggests that when ideas are not acted on, people stop feeling as committed to the group. They're less interested in helping the group to be better through their ideas, right? And this is hugely problematic because that person's next idea might be a real game changer. And so the key challenge here is to figure out how to act on people's good ideas while finding a way to say no to lesser ideas without shutting people down for good. All right. So those are grand challenges. The question then becomes, what can you do specifically? Well, I have 3 tips for managers. 1, empower ideas to be good. 2, make it safe for everyone. And 3, be open and fair. All right, let's start with empowering ideas to be good. So we just talked about good ideas, right? They're multidimensional, they're desirable, they're novel, they're feasible, right? But here's the thing. Most people don't come up with these good ideas at first or on their own or consistently. And so if you want good ideas, you as the manager, you have to empower them, right? And you have to ask yourself, are you enabling employees to come up with desirable ideas by giving them information on the key pain points that are affecting your organization, right? Are you honest with them about the things that really need to be solved, the real problems at stake here, so that they know where to direct their ideas and their solutions? Are you encouraging employees to be novel and breaking set from business as usual? Are you encouraging employees to know what is or is not feasible in the resource environment so they know what a feasible idea looks like? Without these guardrails, right, without these guidelines, employees can't figure out what is necessarily a good idea. Years ago, I wrote my dissertation on surgeon leadership in the operating room. And essentially, I wanted to learn which surgeon behaviors exhibited by how they talked with the team, how that prompted members of the team to speak up with ideas for improvement during a surgical procedure. And so to do this research, I observed 200 plus surgeries of all types, including lap appies, C-sections, hip replacements, right? And what I saw is that surgeons essentially had 3 ways of interacting with their team. There were surgeons who directed, meaning they essentially told people exactly what to do and when. Hand me the scalpel, send this to the lab, right? All according to the master task plan, if you will, of the surgery, right? And surgeons also engaged in coaching behavior. So this was not so much directing people's every move, but rather clarifying the intent of what the procedure, how it should unfold. It also involved updating the team on the master strategy and updating the team on what the surgeon was doing so they could figure out their actions accordingly, right? And the third way surgeons interacted with their team is through relating. And this was essentially shooting the breeze. So talking about their personal lives, making jokes, discussing, what they did over the weekend, asking about the other individual's latest vacation. Now, this kind of rapport bonding, I thought for sure would be something that facilitated ideas, an idea culture, right? After all, if you think of surgeons and the rest of the team, there's quite a bit of power distance there, right? So a leader who engages in relating, well, they're flattening the power distance. They're creating sort of a relational bond, if you will, that should increase the likelihood people will speak up. Well, actually, what I found was it wasn't relating, but rather it was directing and coaching that enabled good ideas to emerge. And this is because the leader, in this case, the surgeon, had the master vision for the operation. And so when they share that task knowledge through directing and primarily through coaching, right, it really made a difference in enabling members of the team to speak up with ideas. And it's not just about leader behavior, it's also about creating a system for developing ideas that add value. So last year, and actually, should I say last year, 1.5 years ago, I had the privilege of winning the PACAR Award for Teaching Excellence from the MBA class of 2019. And one of the perks of receiving this award is a visit to one of the distribution centers of PACCAR. And for those who are unfamiliar, PACCAR is a leading truck manufacturer company headquartered in Bellevue, Washington. So I went to tour one of their distribution centers out in Renton, and what I saw amazed me. They had a vibrant idea culture in place. Employees were asked to generate ideas every 2 weeks and present those ideas to peers and to leadership. But the way this happened was not a free-for-all. Check out this board, okay? If anyone had an idea, they first had to articulate how their idea addressed a problem along 3 key metrics that mattered for the bottom line, specifically safety, quality, and productivity. And actually, there's this 4th one down here that relates to, cost, morale, and environment. But you can see that it was very clear. If you had an idea, it had to fit into one of those buckets, right? And essentially, they were giving the guardrails for what is considered a desirable idea. And then they had a system for follow-up. So after you gave your idea, right, the peers would then vote on whether an idea should be implemented. And then the person who had the idea was then paired with a member of the leadership team to actually get that idea implemented. So in other words, leaders were not simply decision makers, should we act on this idea or not, but they were coaches. They were there to help develop the idea so it would be successful in adding value. Okay, and that's not all either. On the very left side, you can see there's follow-up folders and completed folders. Well, they had a way of tracking the idea for following up, for maintaining a history of knowledge on the ideas that worked, what didn't work. All of this information is valuable that can be used to benchmark future ideas and to make future ideas better. So do you see what's happening here? It's not just about leadership. They created a system that essentially coached employees on how to generate desirable ideas. Okay, so bottom line, if you want good ideas, you need to grow them. And by doing these things, you can foster an idea culture that adds value. All right, let's talk about safety. You have to make it safe for everyone to share their ideas. Years ago, and this is quite famous, Google launched a study of what set apart its highest performing teams from its average performing teams, right? And they scrutinized every attribute of these high performing teams. And what they found was it wasn't the teams with the most resources, talent, or experience that necessarily outperformed the rest. It was the ones with the most psychological safety. All right, so what is psychological safety? My students in the room will say, I remember that, Crystal. It is the shared belief that the team is a safe space for engaging in interpersonally risky behaviors. Behaviors like challenging the status quo, pointing out problems, disagreeing with each other, disagreeing with leadership, making mistakes. A psychologically safe environment means that you can do these things knowing that doing them will not result in the rest of the team seeing you as incompetent, disloyal, or somehow less than. Psychological safety is essential for building an ideal culture because it makes speaking up less risky, right? But it also puts a learning mindset with respect to ideas. It creates space and gives not yet perfect ideas the space to grow. It increases the likelihood also that diverse voices will be heard. Now, what do I mean by diverse voices? Well, the research is pretty clear that people who are not part of a majority group, for instance, women in male dominated industries, underrepresented minorities, newcomers, part time employees, they have a different experience when it comes to speaking up compared to majority members. Minority members are less likely to speak up because they don't enjoy the same level of psychological safety as their counterparts, right? They feel like every one of their moves will be scrutinized. If they say the wrong thing, they will be penalized, right? That constant fear makes it more difficult to hear from these individuals. They are also less likely to have their voices recognized. They're less likely to get credit for their ideas as well because of implicit or explicit ideas, questions about what they have to offer. And so, what this means is that unless you make space for diverse voices, you will end up with an idea culture that is largely driven by majority voices. Now, this is a problem, and I'll explain why. I want to tell you a little bit about my research on minority voices and their importance for creative problem solving. And this research comes from some work that I've done with the US Marine Corps, right? Now, if you're familiar with this context, the Marine Corps is a traditionally male-dominated context, right? And until recently, although certain occupations have been gender integrated, largely there are quite a few occupations within the Marine Corps that have historically been closed off to women. Okay, and so in this context, women are scrutinized for their physical strength, their combat readiness, and their leadership capabilities. And that means it makes it all the harder for women to speak up. Okay. And so what we were interested in is conducting a study to understand, okay, are there conditions, if you were to put a token female, a lone female on a team, right, with three other males, for instance, and you give them a series of tasks to perform, okay, that vary in complexity level, okay, what would be the result? Like, would there be conditions that enabled her to speak up? So first of all, would she speak up? Okay. And if so, what happened to her voice? Would the team actually try out her ideas? And if they did, what was the implication for performance? So to give you a sense of what this looked like, I'll give you an example of a low and high complexity task, okay? So here's the example of a low complexity task. Essentially, this group of 4 Marines were asked to make it through, use a plank to make it through this hole in the wall, okay? Slide down the plank into the other room in order to access this this dummy here. I don't know if I can, let me see if I can just circle it here on a stretcher. And then pull the dummy back through the wall, the hole in the wall, using the plank, and then out of the room. Okay, that was the full requirement of the task. Okay, fairly straightforward. There's really only one way to do this. Okay, so it's a low complexity task. It doesn't require any kind of, out of the box thinking, innovative solutions, right? Here's a high complexity task. So imagine that the team has to split into 2 individuals on this side, 2 other individuals on the other side of the room. And in between is a chemical hazmat zone, okay? No touch, right? Nothing can land in that zone, okay? All you have is some rope and a couple planks. And the important goal here is for the 2 individuals on the far side of the room to somehow pass a box of medical supplies from that side of the room to this side of the room. Okay. How do you do it? I mean, this chasm is wide enough that you can't just toss this thing over, right? You also can't toss a Marine over. That's unsafe behavior. They would get penalized for that solution, okay? The rope is not long enough, so you have to ask yourself, how to solve this problem. This is a high complexity problem. You have to come up with an ingenious solution. Well, it turns out that one of the most popular solutions, if the team could figure it out, is use the plank to gain access to what we would call rafters in the room, and then use that to facilitate sufficient height in order to create a pulley system that would enable the medicine box to safely journey its way to the other side of the room. Okay, that's out of the box thinking, right? Who would have thought of the rafters? okay? And so that's the difference between low and high complexity. Well, what happened when teams listened and acted on the lone female's voice? Well, this graph actually shows you what can happen. So if on the x-axis is how much the lone female got her voice acted upon by the team, and the y-axis here indicates the performance of the team, in this case, how quickly they were able to accomplish the task accurately, right? What you can see is that the more the team, this is the blue line here for high complexity tasks, the more the team acted on the lone female's voice, the higher their performance, right? And in fact, this result, it was fascinating. The teams with the lone female actually outperformed all male teams on these high complexity tasks. Okay, and this was the reason, because they acted on her voice, right? And in fact, if you look at this interesting graph and again follow the blue line, this shows you what happens when the teams acted on the male majority's voice, okay? What you can see is the more they listen to the male majority on these types of tasks, performance suffered, all right? And so what is this saying? This is not making any comments about gender difference or sex differences with respect to quality ideas. The truth is that when there was a token female, she had a different perspective, okay? And because she had that different perspective, if the team was willing to act on that perspective, they were able to break set, just think differently from the norm, which then facilitated their ability to perform on these high complexity tasks, okay? Now, interestingly, if you look at the yellow lines here, the yellow lines are associated with low complexity tasks. And what you can see is that the benefit of acting on the token female's voice is reduced, okay, in low complexity scenarios. And I'm hearing something somewhere. Is someone speaking to me? No? Okay, so should I continue? All right, Kristen says no. Please continue. Okay. All right. So what this is saying is that when tasks are complex, you need that different perspective, right? It is essential for you to be able to outperform, right? And teams do outperform otherwise majority dominated teams, right? And that advantage is primarily found when the task requires that kind of innovative thinking. All right. Okay, so bottom line, diverse voices make it possible for us to think out of the box. And yet, if we don't make it safe for them, we won't hear from them. We won't have been able to make good on that potential. We will have squandered it. And so it's on you, leaders, to make a safe space, particularly for your diverse voices, right? Be an advocate for people's ideas. Make explicit the value and constructive intent behind every idea. You can set rules of engagement and enforce them, right? You can give credit and recognition whenever possible. You can acknowledge your own fallibility and the fallibility of the status quo. Your humility creates a safe space for others to speak up. Okay, 3, be open and fair. So, acting on people's ideas is the key way that managers can reinforce an idea culture. The more you act on ideas, the more people get excited about generating ideas for the future because they see that it pays off, right? Their effort pays off. But what if people just have bad ideas despite best intentions? Well, you are the gatekeeper as the manager. You decide which ideas deserve resources, time, effort, and you can't act on them all. So you have to be judicious. There's nothing quite as tragic as throwing good money after bad ideas. So sometimes you do need to say no for the sake of everyone involved. And so that begs the question, how can we say no well? Well, here's something I've learned about promoting inclusive participation in the MBA classroom. I remember, so anytime anyone makes a comment in class that I have a mixed reaction to, and I'm not sure, whether that's exactly the correct comment, right? The first thing I try to do is remember that every person who walks through these doors is brilliant, has relevant experiences, valid perspectives, and insights that are only made possible through their unique life and professional experiences. Okay. So if someone makes a comment in class that sounds wrong to me, it's really important that I do 3 things. One is I need to acknowledge the effort and intent. This person had the courage to speak up and raise that particular idea or response to our class material. I need to acknowledge it and thank them and appreciate them for that. Second, I need to understand that person's idea, right? And the thinking behind it. This is not the time for me to pull out all my knee-jerk reactions as to why that comment is not right or incorrect. It's really my chance to say, hey, where's the golden nugget here, right? Where's that piece of this person's idea that's really, really valuable? And focus on that. And third, I take time to explain my concerns, not saying this idea is bad, but rather communicating my logic and my thinking, because you never know. My logic and thinking could be wrong in this scenario, right? And we've not had an opportunity to learn from each other through this dialogue if I don't present that opportunity by engaging in some explaining, right? So doing this, it validates the individual, but it also creates a learning experience for everyone in the room that can guide our interactions going forward. And remember, not all bad ideas are created equal. So some ideas might look bad, but once you enact them, you could find that they actually pave the way for really good ideas. And how can you tell? You can't until you try. And this is something that I learned from Amazon, right? Amazon's Jeff Bezos, he talks about these one-way and two-way doors, right? He says that, some ideas, if you choose to act on them, they're not reversible. They're one-way doors. You go through them, you can't come back through, right? But most ideas, most decisions are two-way doors, right? You go through, you try, right? You go through the door, and if you don't like what you see on the other side, you can always revert back, right, to the status quo. Well, I think approaching this idea, approaching acting on ideas with this mindset is super powerful. And the reason is because, knowing that you can always revert to the status quo, well, it takes pressure off of the manager to know whether they're acting on the right ideas. It takes pressure off of the person who proposed the idea to be right. It focuses both parties' attention on the learnings rather than the outcome of the exercise, and it makes it more likely that more ideas get acted upon, therefore supporting perceptions of managerial openness and debunking myths of futility. Okay, last point here. It's important for managers to be receptive, open, and fair. Now, some of us might be wondering, okay, what does fairness have to do with an idea culture? Well, it turns out it's really important. My research suggests that when leaders follow a fair process when evaluating ideas and deciding on whether to act on an idea, that can be even more critical than whether you decide to act on it or not. So what do I mean by fair process? Fair process means making known ahead of time what the criteria is for how you will evaluate ideas. What is the consistent bias-free rules that you will follow to act on ideas, right? And do you involve employees in the decision process? Do they have a voice even in the decision of whether their idea gets enacted? Following these procedures help employees to believe that the system that's receiving their ideas is fair. And it also helps them to feel like valued members of the group, right? It builds their faith that even if their idea isn't acted on today, the system is fair and it's worth trying again tomorrow, right? If you don't have fair process and people's ideas are not enacted, they very quickly conclude that it is not worth their time. They withdraw from the group and you don't hear from them again. So leader fair process is really important. I wanted to show you some recent work that I've been doing on in demonstrating how important leader fair process is. So here you can see that there's a difference between voice that is enacted versus voice that is not enacted, okay? And generally speaking, if you don't get your voice enacted, all right, you're less likely to speak up in the future, right? You see the gap there, okay? But what's really interesting is that if the leader follows a fair process to evaluating and enacting ideas, right, you can see that even in the scenario where someone's voice was not enacted, well, they are just as likely to speak up again in a future scenario as someone whose voice was enacted. Okay, now that's really powerful because essentially what it's showing is that by being fair or by approaching an idea culture with a fair process, leaders can essentially say no to lesser ideas without shutting people down, right? Now, fair process is not just about accountability. It recognizes and proactively combats the realities of unstructured group decision making. Okay, so research suggests that in groups, the ideas that are typically enacted are usually the ones that are shared first by the people who talk the loudest, okay? The people who react the quickest, the extroverts, the ones with charisma, right? And as people are talking, the new ideas, the ideas of those who are quieter, the less and less likely those ideas get surfaced, right? And it happens in the classroom discussion too, right? So if I call on the first hand that I see, I only typically get the majority person's perspective, right? Again, the extrovert, the person who reacts quickly, right? I don't hear from our quieter classmates, right? I typically don't hear from the people who have a different opinion. Okay. And so it's really important that I even the playing field with a random call. And that's what a fair process does here, right? Now, what does it look like for there to be low fair process? Okay, low fair process is failing to communicate a set criteria or failing to follow that criteria when evaluating ideas, soliciting, acting on, and rejecting ideas in a non-systematic way, making decisions in private, not allowing employees to be a part of the conversation, saying no without an explanation. As you can see, low fair process is not necessarily malicious. It's just not being intentional about being fair. Okay, so the bottom line is it takes a ton of effort to be fair, but it's worth it because that's the way you say no to ideas, say no without shutting people down for good. All right, so let me conclude here. And then I'll take some questions, and thank you for your patience. Fostering an idea culture is not easy, right? It requires empowering employees to have desirable, novel, and feasible ideas. It requires creating a safe space for people to speak up, especially those with diverse viewpoints. It requires those with the power to act to treat ideas with openness, transparency, and fairness. And as you can see, much of this hinges on what we do as leaders. But it is also up to each one of us to consider how our actions can foster an idea culture. And that's why I add number 4 here, amplifying each other's voices. Recent research has suggested that if you amplify another person's idea, a peer's idea, for instance, offering public endorsement or giving credit to the speaker, that can elevate not only the group's receptivity to that person's idea, but also the status of the speaker. And guess what? There's no trade-off to the status for yourself, right? People who amplify are actually seen as great citizens, and the team honors that. Okay, so this feels like a very powerful tool at our disposal, especially when we don't have positional power. When it comes to backing up minority voices that otherwise might be drowned out, when it comes to creating psychological safety for others, when it comes to creating receptivity and openness to others' voices. If we all take action on the tips shared in this presentation, we will be able to spark, accelerate, and nurture a culture that engages all organizational members and drives innovation for a better tomorrow. All right, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to that presentation. And I'm really looking forward to the questions that may have accrued in the chat and also other sort of live questions as they come to you. So if it makes sense, I'm going to go ahead and exit my slideshow and see your wonderful faces.
We do have one question. What situations are better to use structured versus unstructured decision making?
Okay, this question is coming from Lisa. Is that right? Elisa, do you want to unmute and tell me a little bit more about the thought behind that question?
Love everything you shared. Big fan in general of this idea culture and taking the time and thought to come up with structured decision making and then the guardrails of what the organization thinks is important.
Yeah.
As I'm thinking about my team and we are implementing some of this, are there some times when unstructured is still better? Like it's not worth the effort.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the way that I would respond to that is, so the thing about unstructured is it can be more efficient, right? But I think it comes at a cost, a quality cost. And that cost is especially large when it comes to the problem that you're facing. So if the decision you're making is one that, isn't straightforward, kind of like the Marine Corps task, right? It's highly complex, okay? Then there's a cost because you've not heard from every individual. You've not spent time sort of soliciting diverse viewpoints, right? And honestly, it takes time and intentionality to get that stuff out there, okay? So taking the unstructured approach, you probably get a lot of decisions made quickly, but recognize that that approach is probably most beneficial and least costly if the problem is not particularly complex, right? There's already a known solution. We just kind of need, a sounding board for it, if you will. And it's also the case when there's not a lot of unshared information. So another way to put this is if it's the case that you have a diverse team, okay, and people are coming to this problem with different information that is private unless shared, then the unstructured approach is really dangerous because you really won't hear from all of these individuals. Does that make sense? So you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of what kind of a problem you have at hand, and then also who has expertise in the room and how is it distributed across individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Great to hear from you.
We have another question. What is the role of incentives in fostering an idea culture?
Ooh, very good. Who's that coming from?
Sumant. Apologies if that's not how you say your name.
Do you want to, let's see. Sumant, do you want to elaborate on your question so I can understand a little bit more as to where that question's coming from?
Sure. I think this is related to your example at Packer, where there was an idea board with problems. But what makes people really come up to the board and offer solutions? Do the people get recognition, or is there something in it for them? Why do they do it? And how do incentives play a role in fostering an idea culture in any organization?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sumant, for that question. And it's a great question. So I can talk a little bit about what I saw at PACCAR as to what was the context that they created to motivate this type of a system for fostering an idea culture. So there was some element of recognition. They actually had this, Kaizen wall of fame where people's pictures would be put up. So it'd be like, the person who had the idea, what exactly was the idea? What was the implementation? Who was the leadership coach who was attached to the idea? And so basically like everyone who was involved is celebrated. And so it feels like a team effort. I don't know if it resulted in, monetary, incentives, but certainly the social recognition was there and there was a lot of celebration around it. But I think it's also important to recognize, and those of you who have been in my leading teams and organizations class will remember that it's not just about extrinsic motivation, right? It's also about intrinsic motivation. And what we realize about people is that we're not just motivated by, extrinsic rewards such as promotions, pay hikes, how much we're paid, et cetera, bonuses. I mean, we respond to those things, but we also respond to feeling like we've made a contribution, made a positive difference, right? Made a significant impact to better the lives of others. And in some cases, those aspects of motivation can be even more powerful in driving behavior, especially behavior that involves creativity. And in the case of fostering idea culture, I think that becomes particularly relevant. So I think the piece around emphasizing, how is your idea changing? How do these people's ideas really are game changing for our business, for our unit? How are we positively impacting the stakeholders we care about, the customers, the clients? How are we meeting their needs better as a result of your idea? I think that could be incredibly powerful to draw that association and to really reinforce that by engaging in this behavior, you have really made a difference that resonates with people.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.
We've got a question from Kelsey.
Hi, Crystal. This is Kelsey Burke from the class of 2018. Thank
Kelsey,
you
so nice to hear from you.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for tuning in.
So I just took a new role within my organization to drive continuous improvement. And the first thing we're doing is setting up a form and a system where people can submit ideas to solve problems. And I'm curious from your example from Packer, where they had to show that problems met, I think it was safety, productivity, and quality. Could you talk a little bit about the trade-off of requiring too much information up front and people being scared and not submitting something versus making it as simple as possible because you can know you have a problem without knowing all those things and then working through it with them and wanting to keep it fair, so wanting to collect information?
I love that. That's such a great question because you're right. One of the reasons why people are hesitant to submit ideas is because they don't feel like they have all the data, right? They don't have a fully crafted solution. And so they're hesitant to put their ideas out there because they know that it feels weak, right? It feels vulnerable to attack and they could be seen as incompetent. And that's risky, right? As we discussed. So I think it's really important that the guardrails are there because I think they do help develop and coach individuals in their thinking. So you're essentially directing them onto the things that are valuable to think about, right? But that being said, I think it's really important to create flexibility within that system. Someone might bring up a problem, right? And they might, vaguely know that it connects to, safety or whatever it is, your 3 key metrics or whatever your core objectives are. But you may want to have some flexibility with respect to the proposed solution, right? So meaning it's okay to submit a problem with the understanding that we as a group are going to come together and brainstorm a solution, right? And I think that that's super important because coming with a problem with the recognition that I need you all to think about this essentially invites everyone to participate with the solution generation process, right? And that also, in addition to getting more expertise, right, in different perspectives, therefore leading to a better solution, it also creates more buy-in, especially if the change you're proposing is going to directly affect the people in the room, right? So getting them involved in talking about the solution is so strategic in increasing the likelihood these people are going to be excited to actually see this change through, okay? So I guess my response to that, Kelsey, is that you have to strike a balance, right? And it's important to utilize the tools that I'm recommending, but also just clarifying the intent, right? So why do we want these buckets? Well, it's not to rule out anybody who has an inkling of a problem but doesn't quite have a solution. It's really there just to guide our conversation to say what is it that we care about, and how does this idea get us closer to where we want to be?
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelsey.
We have a question from Andrew.
Andrew. Hey, Andrew.
How you doing?
Great to see you.
Yeah. If I had known I was going to be on camera, I would have thrown on some flannel.
This is a psychologically safe environment.
Yeah.
We do not judge for lack of flannel.
You're right. So it's great. Thanks for doing this. This has been great. My question was just, I was wondering if in your research you had seen any sort of correlation between those workplaces that were able to create a good idea culture and some level of resource abundance or resource availability. Because what I said in the chat was I can imagine that in resource constrained environments, there might be a disincentive to share ideas, either because the switching costs are too high or because somebody doesn't want to own a large scale change initiative on top of their day-to-day job. So
Fantastic question. Okay, so I haven't studied this systematically, but anecdotal evidence would suggest that organizations or units, yes, they're going to vary in terms of their resource abundance, right? And that, my understanding is that affects. So in the best scenario, so in the worst scenarios, they just shut down the idea culture because they say, we can't do anything. We can't afford to do anything. We're just totally stretched, right? At the same time, though, I think in the best scenarios, an organization could acknowledge those resource constraints and then be clear to employees as to how does that then shift the criteria for what makes for a good idea. Okay, so remember how we talked about like a desirable idea, a good idea has to be desirable, it has to be novel, and it has to be feasible, right? Well, the resource situation is going to color that last piece, right? What's feasible, right? And so I think it's still possible to have, to foster an idea culture, even in a resource constrained environment. And in fact, a lot of research has shown that when people are constrained in their resources, they get even more creative about how to solve their problems, right? Because the constraints allow them to then, get really creative about how do we, achieve this with only that, right? Or within the, how do we, so when it's done well, I would say, leaders are acknowledging and being clear about where the resource constraints are, but that doesn't necessarily hinder people from coming up with ideas. It just helps, it just educates members on what kinds of ideas are going to be feasible, and then work within those constraints to think about the novelty piece and the desirability piece. Does that make sense, Andrew?
Yeah. Necessity is the mother of invention. So
absolutely.
I hear what you're saying.
And I'll tell you, I gave a version of this talk at Amazon earlier this summer. And the first thing that they pushed back on is feasibility. I mean, they straight up told me, we don't really care about feasibility because anything that looks infeasible, well, we make it feasible. I'm like, okay, point taken. And I think what I learned from that is that different organizations, depending on their strategy, depending on their resource scenario, right, depending on their position in the industry competition, right, they are going to value those three criteria for good ideas differently. Sure. So for Amazon, I think novelty and desirability are king and queen, right? And then feasibility a little bit less so, right? Yeah. Another organization, perhaps one that you're describing that might be a little bit more resource constrained, feasibility is core. And then it's like, can we do something desirable? And can we do something that's novel, right? Yeah. Thank you for that question.
You got it.
All right, we have time for one more question, and we have one from Johnson.
Hey, Johnson.
Hey there. From Team MBA 2020 graduate.
Great.
I have a question about when you're working with people of different thoughts who see work differently. Very specifically, I want to just kind of say that, well, everyone has different age groups, and some are baby boomers and some are millennials. So with those stereotypes, what I'm saying is that there are a lot of dynamics that happen in between there. You could say a baby boomer saying, oh, I've seen your kind before. It's just another kind of program. It's going to pass by. Or it could be a millennial who would be really engaged, really want to push the dreams and actually make something innovative, or those who want to have a lot of attention. So how has your research kind of helped contextualize some of the practices that we try to do? So for example, taking more time and such. What are your thoughts?
Okay. So Johnson, if I could restate the comment, is it what you're describing is that when there's diversity in the group, right, whether it be age or something else, right, people have different ideas around what is a good idea, what is, what do we want to prioritize here, what's going to be desirable, and I think that's a very fair point, right? I mean, in my presentation, I've made it pretty simplistic, like as if it would be, universal agreement as to what is desirable, what's novel, what's feasible, right? But in reality, it really is quite a subjective process, right? And people's unique experiences and perspectives are going to be weighed into that process in how they look at how they generate ideas, but also how they evaluate other people's ideas, right? And so I think if I could understand your question, it seems that you're wondering what can be done to kind of bring these different perspectives into alignment so that we could have we could foster an idea culture that adds value, as the presentation would suggest, right? Is that so?
That's the question.
Okay, that's the question. All right, so I think this is great. I mean, I think it's so. The first thing is to say, I think that every perspective is valuable somewhere. Okay, meaning that it shouldn't be up to one individual to decide what's a good idea, right? It can't be, because that person, there's no way that person holds all the information as to what's going to be relevant to this problem and relevant to evaluating the idea, right? So it seems like what's really important is that there is a discussion around all these different perspectives and to consider those perspectives when making a judgment, right? In fact, that's what makes for a fair process, is that we do hear from other people, we do hear all the perspectives, and we do allow people to have a voice in that process. And that's essential, right? If you make the decision unilaterally, people don't feel like they have a voice, they don't feel like it's a fair process, right? That being said, at some point you got to align people. And it turns out, the research would suggest that alignment is most easily built, especially across a diverse group of stakeholders, when you emphasize the common task goals. Okay. And so when you're able to say, okay, I understand all the perspectives in the room, but let's remember, what is it that we're actually going for here, right? And how do all those perspectives help us to get to that goal? I think companies with really strong cultures that clearly indicate, what are our priorities, that's a super helpful tool for doing this, because it should be clear to all individuals, regardless of their background, regardless of their perspective, regardless what function they're coming from, that this is the priority, right? And so invoking those things can quickly bring everyone together, right? Sometimes the culture is not strong, and then you as the leader, you have to articulate those things, right? And make it known to the group, what are our goals, and then how do they then help to align the conversation. So I know that's a fairly abstract response, but I think the intent is that you do need to hear from everybody, right? And the fact that people do have different perspectives is actually key to ensuring that the process is fair, right? And that it's going to be a decision that benefits everyone.
I agree. Thank you. I appreciate that insight.
Thanks, Johnson.
And I think that brings us to the top of the hour. And so, Crystal, well, first of all, let me ask everybody to unmute at this point, because I want everybody to actually hear the appreciation or for you to hear the appreciation that we all have for you. So let me start with a big thank you to Crystal. Everyone, if you go ahead and give some applause, I totally appreciate hearing a little noise in this world that's all virtual clapping and thumbs up. I think every now and then a little bit of noise goes a long way. So Crystal, truly thank you for being here. I also want to thank my teammates Kristen and Krista. And just so you know, Associate Professor of Finance Thomas Gilbert will join us for our next Lunch and Learn on December 2nd. I hope you'll join us as we explore the topic of machine learning. Keep your eye out for upcoming activities on Foster's LinkedIn page and the alumni page at foster.uw.edu. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and go dogs.
Woo! Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. It was so great to see all of you.